Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Barbara and Jan, for the invitation. So in this talk, I will also discuss a lot of the topics that have been presented and discussed by Marianne. And what I will try to do is to talk again about this balance of moment that we have, and in a more general way to try to understand what are the relationships between the different sleep modes that we can observe at the subduction interface, especially thanks to continuous GPS data that during the last decades allowed us to see not only the interseismic locking, but the transient seismic sleep. So I will move and I will focus on a different part of the same subduction zone as Marianne, and we'll talk about the Northern Andes. And this is a work that has been developed during the last 10 years under the frame of a joint international laboratory, mainly with the Ecuadorian colleagues. So, as we saw in the previous talk, so the South American Nazca plate boundary is highly seismic. And if we look at the regional scale, at the scale of the plate boundary, we'll see that almost the entire length of the subduction zone has ruptured during grid earthquakes, at least since we have a historical record since the 16th century when the Spanish conquistador arrived in South America. And we also see yes, we see that there is an exception to this. And this exception goes from central Peru and to southern Ecuador, where we don't have any known large earthquakes. And what we have instead is tsunami earthquakes. That means earthquakes that are probably very low Rupture propagation velocities that emitted very low level of high frequencies, and that finally generate high, large tsunami with respect to their relatively moderate magnitudes. So the first thing we did to understand how this part of the subduction zone is working is to build a regional horizontal velocity field with GPS, and here is the result of what we have. So the velocities here are expressed with respect to what we believe is the stable part of the South American plate. And we see that with respect to this reference frame, we can see two different trends. Here in Ecuador, there is an east to northeastward motion at about 1 centimeter. Of course, there are some variations within this velocity field. And here we see 5 to 6 millimeters per year southeastward motion. So as Marianne said during the previous talk, so this velocity field represents the contribution of two different effects. One is the long-term continental deformation, and the second one is due to locking at the subduction interface. So in order to separate the two effects, so what we did is to look at different areas where we don't have any strain rate, no internal deformation. That means that the effect of locking at the subduction is very small. So when we do this, we can define the boundary of the continental sliver. Here is the boundary for what we call the North Andean sliver, and we can estimate its kinematics. It's about 1 centimeter per year in a northeastward direction. And what we call the Inca sliver, we don't have any information for the eastern boundary, which is moving at 5.5 millimeter per year. So when we remove the motion of this sliver, you can see very small residuals indicating that they almost behave rigidly without any internal deformation. And then we believe that we are left with the effect of locking at the subduction megathrust. And we use these residual velocities to do what Marianne presented as the locking level at the subduction interface, and this is our result. We see that we have very high level of locking, up possibly to 50 kilometers depth in central Peru. high locking again in central Ecuador. And we see that between the two, we have a very long segment, more than a 1,000 kilometer long segment without any strain accumulation. So when we compare this with the history of the past large earthquakes, we see that there is a very good correlation between the two, and I will come back to this for the case of Ecuador. And we see that this very long creeping segment is where we have the tsunami earthquakes, and that makes sense. And with respect to Tim's question here, this is a damped inversion assuming a null a priori model, and this is an inversion assuming a full coupled model. And we see that the GPS allows coupling close to the trench that would be consistent with the tsunami earthquake, rupturing the shallow, weak material close to the trench. So that's the first result. And if we put it into the context of the subduction around the Pacific, we can see that about 20% of the length of the subduction behave this way, that is, are creeping subduction, either in Central America or in the Aleutian. So now I will go to Ecuador and discuss a very large seismic sequence that has occurred during the 20th century and was prolongated with the last earthquake that occurred last year. So the sequence, I would say, started in 1906. The whole sequence has been recorded by seismometers, so we have estimates of the magnitude, and that will be the base to make this moment that Marianne was also mentioning previously. So the 1906 earthquake has probably ruptured something like 400 to 500 kilometers along this segment. There are some discussions, some debate about its magnitude and its possible southern extent, but it was a large earthquake in this area. Then we have another earthquake, magnitude 7.8 in 1942, that probably partly ruptured part of the southern part of the 1906 earthquake. Another earthquake which generated a tsunami in 58, magnitude 7.7, and another one further north, 8.2 in 79. And I will talk about the 2016 earthquake. So of course, what the question raised by this sequence of large earthquakes, it's whether it's consistent or not with the strain accumulation that we're seeing with the GPS. So a few words about this earthquake. So it occurred in central northern Ecuador. You see here that the acceleration, the PGA exceeded 1G at some places. There were very large damages, and it causes the death of about 700 people, and finally impacted the life of more than 1 million people living in coastal area in Ecuador. So this time we could observe very well this earthquake. This is the presumed area. You can see the accelerometer and the GPS. And I'm just showing what we see with the high rate GPS for a site located here. And you can see that the GPS can see, of course, the static displacement, but also the wave. And the amplitude here of the kinematic or the dynamic ground motion is about 2 meters over a few seconds. Then we have the static displacement, either seen by GPS or by an INSAR processed by Raphaël Grandin. These are Sentinel data, these are ALOS data and Sentinel data. And what you can see here is that the motion is what you expect for a thrust event accommodating some slip at the megathrust with this convergence and trenchward motion. But you can see some differences for these sites with the SAS component, which is what you would expect when you are at the edge of the slip area or the dislocation. So this area constrained the southern extent of the rupture for this earthquake. Here in red is the fit from a kinematic model made by Martin Vallée to the data shown in gray. And I would like just to draw your attention to two accelerograms. So one is for sites AATC, which is about 40 kilometers north of the presumed area of the rupture, and AMNT, which is at the opposite, same distance, but south of the rupture. And you can see that for the southern accelerometer, the waveform is very simple. It looks like a pulse. And if we compare it to the same to the north, the waveform is more complicated and with a magnitude divided by 8 more or less. So this is a direct evidence of a directivity due to the southward propagation of the rupture. So hopefully that will work. So I will show an animation. Oops, sorry, this is not this one. Yeah, of the rupture. So this is a movie of the cumulated displacement through time, perhaps. Yes. So we see very little moment release during the first seconds, then the rupture of the first asperities with slip reaching 3 meters, propagation to the south, and then the rupture of the main asperities. This is the main moment release with slip exceeding 6 meters. So if we look now at the displacement every second, so what we see is that this rupture propagated south and has a very pulse-like shape. So when we have this, so this is the co-seismic slip, the northern asperities, the southern asperities. We can come back to the interseismic and see how it compares, and of course, put it into the context of the large seismic sequence. So when we report the rupture area over the interseismic coupling map, so we see that the earthquake had slip where we had high locking before, during the year previous the earthquake, and it looks like it only broke a part of the highly locked area and left some other area unbroken yet. The second thing is to compare with what happened in 1942. So this is the assumed a relocation of the 42 earthquakes, and this is the main moment area of moment released as proposed by Swenson and Beck. And you can see that there is likely an overlap between the two, and they possibly have broken the same asperity twice. So in order to have some other elements or arguments to see whether these two earthquakes rupture the same asperity or not, we can look at the waveform that has been recorded for the two earthquakes at the site DBN in the Netherlands at teleseismic distance. And when they are superimposed such a way or deconvolved from the instrumental response so that they can be directly compared. So if they are aligned for the first arrival of the P wave, you can see that the 2016 signal seems to have a longer duration with respect to the 42 earthquake, but you can see that if you shift this by 15 seconds, you have a very similar waveform. And what Martin Vallée did is, since the source time function seems to be shorter for the 42 earthquake, what we will do is to shift the hypocenter in the middle of the rupture, then use the same propagation rupture velocity as we have found for the 2016 earthquakes and use the same slip distribution. And then we can simulate the waveform at DBN, and you can see that both earthquakes had a very similar waveform. So this is not a proof, but this is a strong evidence that they ruptured the same area with the same mechanism. So the information that we have, we cannot demonstrate, of course, that they ruptured the same asperities because we don't have the resolution for the 42 earthquake, but all the indication that we have is that they at least had a large overlap. So assuming this overlap, I will come back to some moment balance. So in terms of peak sleep, so we know from the GPS that The long-term slip rate at the megathrust is about 4.7 centimeter per year. If we calculate it using the time period between 42 and 2016, then we have a slip deficit of about 3.5 meter. And this is smaller than the 6 meter of picoseismic slip. So of course, this picoseismic slip might be due to some dynamic of the rupture, so a more robust number is to do the integral of slip over the rupture area. And when we do this calculation, we still find that the slip released during the 2016 earthquakes exceeds and is larger to the slip deficit accumulated since 1942. And of course, the same calculation is even more important if we consider the period between 1906 and 1942. So now I will relax the hypothesis that the two earthquakes ruptured the same asperities. I will assume that they were very close, but along the same segment. I can calculate a moment deficit rate with some error bars, and I can make the comparison to what has been released by the two earthquakes. And in this case, we still find that the two earthquakes released more moment compared to what is expected from the GPS inversion. And these two earthquake contrast with the seismic quiescence that we know before 1906. There is no earthquakes documented in historical records, and we believe that at least we have good historical records for the 18th and the 19th century in this area. So we can do the same calculation for the other earthquake of the sequence. For the 58 earthquakes, we just assume 100% coupling, that is the plate motion. We do the calculation and we still find that the moment for this earthquake is still larger to what had been accumulated since 1906, and this is also true for the 1979 earthquake. So that's the conclusion. All the moment released seismically through earthquakes is larger to what had been accumulated before. So the simplest explanation for this is that this sequence is releasing stress that had been accumulated for a long time before 1906. So a way to test this hypothesis is to do paleoseismology, and I show the first marine paleoseismology results. This is the result of a core taken here in northern Ecuador, where our colleagues could identify the turbidites triggered by all the large earthquakes during the 20th century. And you can see that before 1906, there is a period where they don't find this type of turbidites. And they find, again, a good event sometime during the Middle Age, and possibly two events after this. So at least this data confirms that during 1906 there was a period of quiescence during a few centuries. So that will be the conclusion for this part of the talk. What we see for this seismic sequence is abnormally large with respect to the present-day rate of strain accumulation, and it rather corresponds to a release of moment deficit accumulated over 2 or 3 centuries before 1906. So putting it in a very simple scheme for the earthquake cycle, we have here the slip at the megathrust. So during the interseismic, we have no motion, and then the earthquake will catch up with the slip deficit so that it equals the long-term plate motion. This is, of course, something very ideal. But what we see here is how far we can move from this simple model. In the case of Ecuador, we had a long period, quiet period before 1906, and then a cascade of different earthquakes that will try to catch up with the deficit accumulated over several centuries. And the implication for the seismic hazard is that even if we have large earthquakes in an area, since, as Marianne said, we don't have the initial stress, we don't know whether we will start an period of enhanced seismic release, or if we will release what had been accumulated before. So from this, I will to move now to the shorter period and try to see what we saw before the 2016 earthquakes and immediately after, and to see how the sleep are organized. I will start by showing a kinematic inversion of the early aftersleep during a month following the 2016 earthquake. So this is what we have after one day here. We see that even after 1 day, we're starting to develop some aftersleep at some identified patches, most probably up deep of the rupture. I will show the rupture is located here. After 3 days, this goes on. We're starting to see something down deep of the rupture. And I draw your attention here because we will have a slow sleep event that is triggered and started about 3 days after the earthquake. And then we move to this. We see the sleep developing at these two identified patches. Okay. And this is our final result after a month. So if we report the rupture, so we see that the two main patches developed up deep of the rupture. The slow sleep, triggered slow sleep event occurred about 100 kilometers further south, and we have this shape of deep aftersleep. Here, in the gray point show the distribution of the aftershocks. You see that the aftershocks appear to be surrounding the area of main aftersleep, and in this plots, what I show is the evolution of the cumulated number of aftershock with respect to the cumulated sleep observed at the different patch. And what you see is that there is the same temporal evolution between the two. So the conclusion for this is that the aftershock sequence seems to be driven by the evolution of the seismic sleep. The second conclusion is that after a month, the total post-seismic moment is 7.4, that is about a third of the co-seismic moment released. So this type of aftersleep has three unusual properties. So the first one is that it developed aftersleep at localized patches, and we would expect aftersleep to be driven by the stress increment generated by the co-seismic sleep, and this is what is shown in red. You see that we will have some kind of radial pattern, and there is little correlation between the two. The second property is that if we compared this level of aftersleep, this amount of aftersleep with respect to what had been inferred or found for the Pisco and Maule earthquake at the same subduction zone, we see that this aftersleep is very rapid during the first month with respect to these two earthquakes. And the third unusual properties of this is that the aftersleep developed in some areas that were weakly locked before the earthquake, but some others seems to occur similarly to the triggered slow sleep event in areas that were locked at least during the years before the earthquake. So in order to try to find an explanation for this, we went back to the interseismic period. And this is a work done by Sandro Vaca during his PhD. We will focus on this area, which is located north of the rupture of the 2016 earthquake and corresponding to an area of high aftersleep. And what I will show is the result of a kinematic inversion of a slow sleep together with the evolution of the microseismicity. So we see sleep developing in this area. Seismicity, microseismicity appear to be surrounding the area of sleep. And in a second phase of this slow sleep, we have propagation, possible propagation to the north and at shallower depths. So in this case, so the moment for this slow sleep event is 6.3. So what we did is to do this type of search systematically before the 2016 earthquake. So here I report what I show you, the extent of the slow slip event that we found. We tried to find a slow slip event in this area. We didn't find it in the GPS time series. What we find is that this area has experienced seismic swarms occurring every 4 years, more or less. So it has a seismicity occurring as swarm. And the second characteristic is we look at repeating earthquakes. So repeating earthquakes are indirect indicators of creep at the fault. So you can see the similarity of the waveform. And here is the time series of the cumulated similar earthquakes that we find in this area. And we believe that they indicate small slow slip events that were not detected by the GPS. And finally, we looked at this area. So we have a transient signal that is seen at several sites. And when we calculate the displacement, we can see that we have this pattern that constrains the slip to be located at about 50 to 60 kilometers along the subduction interface. So what we see here is that enhanced afterslip occurred at areas that had experienced slow slip event before the earthquake. So that will be my summary of the slip mode that we find at the Ecuador subduction zone. That's perfect. So during the interseismic period, so what we see is that the megathrust is made of patches being either locked or sliding at the plate motion velocities. There is some kind of heterogeneity in this. And superimposed to this long-term trend, we have area where we have slow slip event that we can either detect geodetically or indirectly through seismic swarms or series of repeating earthquake. When the earthquake occurred, it ruptured only part of the area that were highly locked. Then we have the afterslip. The afterslip can develop either in low coupled area, okay, but also in areas that were locked previously to before the earthquake. But in all cases, in Ecuador, what we have is that this area of larger afterslip occurred where we had slow slip event before the earthquake. So the interpretation that we made for this is that we need to move a little bit beyond the simple view of having locked area being seismic. Some area that are locked are seismic, but some other may release part of the stress seismically and making some barriers to the earthquake propagation because they release stress and because they don't like to be seismic. So that will be my conclusions. I believe that we see in Ecuador some spatial and temporal organization of slip modes. It looks like the subduction interface is made of interlaced patches, either sliding at the plate velocities or being locked. But also some patches appear to be locked during a few years. Some of them release stress seismically, while others are seismic. So there are some implications for the friction anatomy of the subduction interface. This view appears to be more complex than the classical view of having velocity weakening patches being seismic embedded within an otherwise creeping velocity strengthening plate interface. And I believe that velocity weakening patches might have a great diversity of behavior, and among them they can host afterslip. And finally, the case of Ecuador, I don't know how this can be generalized or not, but a better anticipation for the location of future earthquake can be gained if we can document precisely and jointly the interseismic locking and the episodic transient slips. Thank you.